Welcome to the Hardin-Jefferson Bond 2020 podcast. My name is Brad Bullion, and I am the Director of Operations for Hardin-Jefferson ISD. In March, I was interviewed by Rebecca Gardner of the Sour Lake Chamber of Commerce. This podcast was recorded when we were planning on having a May election. We have since recorded an update, which covers changes due to COVID and moving the election to November. Please note that the tax effects in this podcast have changed slightly since it was recorded. Please see the website or the podcast update for the current information. We hope you enjoy the podcast.
My name is Rebecca Gardner, and I'm the Executive Director at the Sour Lake Chamber. And we're here to talk about the Harvey recovery process and the 2020 bond. So today we have Brad Bullion, Director of Operations at Hardin-Jefferson.
Hello.
And he's been the Director of Operations for 13 years?
That's correct.
Yes. And you have been heading the FEMA recovery process for the district, right?
Yeah, so basically I'm Director of Operations, which means I oversee all the departments that are non-educational. So our department's role is to take away every barrier from the teacher reaching the student. And so the teacher doesn't have to, or the student doesn't have to worry about being fed, being hungry during class is where our child nutrition department comes in. They don't have to worry about getting to school is what we do with transportation. And then our maintenance, custodial, and finance departments make sure that they don't have to worry about whether the classroom's clean, whether they have good air conditioning, the room's comfortable, the lights work, the teacher's getting paid. So we take away barriers to make sure that the teacher, all they have to focus on is reaching that child and touching that student to make sure that they get the education that they deserve and that they've come to expect from Hardin-Jefferson.
Gotcha. Awesome. So I want to let's jump into the bond proposal. So can you tell me, Brad, did this start because of Harvey, right? This bond is about rebuilding. Can you tell me the damage that the school
Absolutely.
received?
So actually, this started 2.5 years ago when Tropical Storm Harvey hit Southeast Texas.
Right.
And the very beginnings of the rebuilding process was determining what we were going to do. We knew we had a flooded campus. We knew we had several flooded buildings. But actually, before we were able to get back to the community, other than by boat, and our maintenance director
Right.
who was visiting the site daily by boat, we actually had a board meeting in my house in Beaumont because it was the only location that any of us could get to because everybody else's house was either flooded or landlocked.
Yes.
And so we had a meeting at that point to discuss what the preliminary damage assessments were and how we were going to move forward. And that's when we decided to put together Henderson Village. Mm-hmm. And that is what we call the temporary campus for Henderson Middle School, the Village. And we actually started that day putting the plans together to have that campus set up. Really pretty proud of that project. In around 12 weeks from the storm, we were actually opening the doors of the Village, and while some of the other schools were still worrying or trying to figure out what to do or running split schedules, our kids had a very well-built temporary campus to have a good education in, because many of them, not just students but teachers, still didn't have homes. Right. And we're trying to rebuild themselves, so we knew it was imperative for our community to get back on its feet to do that project quickly, and so we did. But as soon as that ended, we need to figure out what we were going to do because that was just a temporary solution.
Right.
And so for the past 2.5 years, we've been working with FEMA and trying to get those projects through the FEMA process, which can be quite a daunting task. So the PDMG is my day-to-day contact, the person that kind of helps move all our paperwork and help us through that process. I believe I'm on my 5th or 6th one now. So every time there's a turnover, there's reteaching them the specifics of what's going on and what's happening. So it's been a pretty long process. But to answer your initial question on what buildings were damaged, Greg, if you could go to slide 3. We've got a slide here that shows an aerial of the middle school campus. Mm-hmm. And there's a red dot on every building that was flooded and deemed substantially damaged.
Wow. There's 11 dots
in the Harvey process. There is 11 dots. And so you've got the middle school, the practice gym, an old commodity storage building, an auto mechanic shop. There was a DAP building, the technology building, which was also an indoor athletic facility, band concession, athletic concession, both home and visitors restrooms, and the field house. Now, I want to define substantial damage. So substantial damage is damage to a building in a floodplain. So this is specific to floodplain law. This is actually an NFIP program code standard or law that says if your building is in the floodplain, which all 11 of these are, and it sustains damage more than 50% of its fair market value, then you are required to bring that building up to code. And what they mean by bring that building up to code means you have to bring it up to or above base flood elevation. And we are required to bring all of these buildings above a foot above BFE, which is base flood elevation. All of these were anywhere from 2 feet to 3 or 4 feet below base flood elevation, and so we're required to replace them. So, we get lots of questions of why haven't you done anything yet?
Right, that's the question. They flooded. They've been sitting there for 2 years. Why haven't you gone in there and done any rebuilding or tear it down?
And the reason is that's the law. The law states that we have to elevate these buildings before we can put repair dollars in them. And so that's why we didn't go in and renovate the building, because preliminary estimates told us right off that we were going to be well above 50% of that fair market value metric. Actually, the middle school is the one building that was not only 50%, more than 50% of damage over fair market value, it actually was more than 50% over replacement value, which is even a higher standard that you have to hit to get with some levels of FEMA funding. And so that one actually hit the 50% of replacement value. So they were damaged. They were basically kind of in home insurance terms, they've been totaled.
Gotcha.
And in order for us to put repair dollars in them legally to adhere to the floodplain rules, we have to elevate them. And you can't, you may have seen smaller buildings be elevated. It's easy to elevate a pier and beam house, but elevating a 100,000 square foot structure is just not cost feasible. And those estimates, actually every building went through a cost estimate of whether it was more cost feasible through the FEMA process to elevate, to destroy, elevate, and replace, or to elevate the structure. And so even though sometimes it's not technically feasible, they have to go through the process, and they did. And in every instance, elevation was the answer. And so our plan is to tear down all of these buildings, replace most of them, and consolidate some of them. So I guess let's go ahead and talk about what those projects are.
Right.
Okay. That is slide 18. This is the projects and the cost. So we're looking to replace Henderson Middle School.
And that's going to be the $45 million.
And that is at a cost of $45 million, yes.
And how did you come up with these numbers? Is this something that the school does?
Okay, so not early in this process, I guess about a year ago, we hired an architect to help us with this process. And I guess twofold. So one, we used FEMA and FEMA consultants to put together reconstruction or repair estimates to prove that the damage was over that 50% metric.
Gotcha.
And so that was all corroborated by FEMA and then tested and then retested and then retested through the FEMA process. But when looking at repair dollars and what actual costs were going to be, we hired an architect and had them help put these budget numbers together.
And that's PBK, right? That you've been seeing on the website, your flyers.
Correct. PBK is the architect that the district hired.
I know a lot of questions were, why didn't you go out for bids? Why are you working with just them? Why didn't you go get a bunch of bids from a bunch of people?
Okay, so I think there's some confusion on this, why didn't you get bids part.
Right.
So when you build major construction projects,
This is pretty major.
Well,
Really
you
good.
need to realize a construction set of documents here is hundreds and hundreds of pages.
Right.
And they take about a year to develop. So when you're looking to undertake a project of this size and magnitude, one, you're required to engage an architect. And the way the state law is written, the way you acquire an architect is you send out what is called a request for qualification. The law actually prohibits you selecting architects based off of fees, but you select them based off of their qualifications. And so once you go through the process of selecting the most qualified for your district architect, you then negotiate price. And it's fairly standard. We've had several architects over the course of Hardin Jefferson, and it's fairly standard that architects charge 6% of the cost of work.
Gotcha.
And we had done some work with PBK. PBK is actually the architect that came in and helped us build Henderson Village in 12 weeks. And had they not put all their resources behind it, I don't believe we would have gotten that thing on the ground as fast as we did. And it's a really great quality portable campus. If you haven't visited yet, I would encourage you to.
Yes, yeah. Well, can I just interject real quick? How was that funded? How was Henderson Village funded?
So Henderson Village was FEMA funded.
Okay.
And so it was eligible as a temporary structure. It was eligible for cost reimbursement under the FEMA program. But most all of the FEMA grants are on a 90-10 split. So they pay 90%, and then we're required to pay 10% of the cost. However, we actually wrote a grant with it was a Texas Recovery Grant. And that's not the actual name of it. But anyway, it was a grant for the extra 10% cost.
So it didn't cost the school.
So actually that village didn't cost the school anything.
Wow.
Correct.
Okay.
So it was around a $3.5 million grant. Yes, it was by, thank you, it was Rebuild Texas.
Gotcha.
Rebuild Texas is who funded that. It was a great organization. A lot of donors put money into a pool. And then they set up this organization that helped several districts across the area, or several entities across the area. And very thankful for those dollars, because that was around $350,000 in grant funds.
Wow, that's awesome. I didn't know that.
So back to the architect question. We then selected we had good experience with PBK. They built the high school. They had built China Elementary. We had actually went with a different architect on some of our other bond work and smaller projects in the meantime. And we were looking forward to going back to the experience and the quality that we had had before. And so after our experience in the village, we felt like, and then looking through the qualifications that we got from architects, we felt like they were going to be the most qualified for us. We entered into a contract to help us with the recovery and rebuild process, because quite frankly, we don't have the resources to determine what exactly is needed for a 130,000 square foot building at a cost of $45 million, and we needed professionals to help us with that. Now, when you say, why didn't you bid the work? Okay, so the work to build the high school, these are estimates put together by our architects. And if you're thinking they're high, at first we were too. We acknowledge, we knew that we had built a high school in 2007 for around $147 a square foot. So it was around 156,000 square foot building for not doing the math, $25 million, somewhere in that range. And so when the cost came back originally 2.5 years ago, prior to inflation, that rebuilding costs would be somewhere in the $220 to $250 range, we were astounded. And so we were in disbelief as well, and we immediately went to contractors that we knew in the area, say that were building schools, and asked them, and they corroborated that information. Now we've had 2.5 years of inflation. There is some uncertainty on what the cost will be with a FEMA contract. So FEMA contracts are very stringent in the way they're written, and there's a whole lot of requirements that are placed upon not only the district, but the contractor and the subcontractors that scare some subcontractors. So we have to make sure that we have enough money in this project to actually say we're going to do what we're going to be able to do. We did also look at the AGC puts out a report in the greater Houston area, which includes the Beaumont area. We looked at their report, and they showed what average middle schools were costing, and all of the numbers are on track of what we put together. And so this represents what we feel like it's going to cost to build a building a year from now. And so this includes inflation from now till then, and our best estimates on what that's going to cost is at $285 a square foot. And so that's what this budget is based off of. But that number also includes the demo of the old building. It includes parking and paving that goes around the building. It includes the elevation of the building, not just to 1 foot above BFE, but to 2 foot above BFE. It includes the mitigation and retention ponds that we're going to be required to build for this building. It includes the architect fees. It includes technology that we'll have to add to the building. It includes furniture and fixtures and testing and commissioning.
So it's turnkey is everything.
It is a turnkey price.
And I'm glad you said something about inflation, because I was thinking, what's the process after, okay, let's say you go out for bids. How does it work? Is FEMA going to say, okay, you're getting X amount of dollars? Do they tell you exactly how much you're going to get and you work from there? Or is FEMA going to cover 100% of this project, I guess is my question?
FEMA is not going to cover 100% of this project.
And that's why we're going out for the bond.
That is correct. That is where we're going out for a bond. So FEMA is going to pay, if we'll go back to slide 5.
Okay.
So originally when we started this FEMA process, we felt like we were going to get, or the original estimates from our consultants is that we were going to be eligible for around $7 to $17 million in reimbursement funds. After 2.5 years of a lot of hard work and due diligence, we were able to write $43 million worth of grants with FEMA, or $43 million worth of projects. We added around $600,000 of mitigation funds, which allows us to build the buildings at 2 feet above BFE instead of just 1 foot, which the existing high school is at 1 foot above BFE, and it did not flood during Harvey. And so we're going a foot higher than that.
Will that affect the high school at all if you build the junior high up higher, if we have this another 100-year flood that's happened twice now?
No, it will not.
It will not. Okay.
No, it will not. And let's expound on that in a minute. I'd like to kind of dive deeper into that, but to stay on the the FEMA dollars. So the total, and then there's some insurance reduction dollars. And so the total FEMA project would be right around $41.8 million. And then they pay 90%, we pay 10%. So we're eligible for $37.7 million of reimbursement once we rebuild the buildings. Okay. So we don't have the money right now.
So you're not sitting on a pile of cash.
We're not sitting on a pile of cash. What actually happens is these funds are obligated, and the funds go into the Texas Department of Emergency Management's bank account. And then once we rebuild and prove that we procure this building correctly, and then something I didn't hit on, we talked about procurement a little bit earlier. I did want to say that FEMA requires hard bids. So this will hit the street, and the lowest qualified builder will get this job. And so that's how the bid process will work once we actually do get to bidding these buildings. But you have to build the construction documents before you can get to that point. We're a year away from that at this point.
Okay.
But we will be eligible to draw down $37.7 million once we rebuild these projects. All of these projects would have to get rebuilt prior to us tapping all of that money. There's different amounts for each project, but to get to the total, we'd have to rebuild everything. And something I want to hit on, we catch a lot of flack for why didn't we have more insurance?
That's a really good question.
And so I get that question a lot. Why didn't we have more insurance? What were we insured for? Did we have any insurance? And so the answer is yes, we did have insurance. On the middle school in particular, we had 2 NFIP policies, so National Floodplain Insurance Program, same program that people buy flood insurance with their houses.
Okay.
But now commercially, the highest limits you can get with an NFIP policy are $500,000 for contents and $500,000 for the building. So
doesn't sound like enough to cover it.
Obviously, it wasn't. So we had a $1 million policy for contents and coverage, which we received on the building, and then on the gym separately, not the practice gym, but the game gym. Just talking about Henderson Middle School core,
right.
We had another $500,000 building policy, and then a smaller contents policy because there's not that much contents in that gym, and so we did receive that. And so the question is, well, why don't you have a $10 or $20 million policy? You should have known the risk. I think we got caught up in 2 factors, really. The same thing that pretty much everyone in Pinewood and Bevel Oaks said, well, if we survive the 94 flood,
it will never flood again.
We're going to be okay. Obviously, that was wrong.
Right.
And the second part is we have to look at operating cost. And the cost for a policy, a $10 million policy, could cost upwards to 6 or 8 teachers per year.
Wow.
And so when you look at the cost benefit, the decision was made that this is a good level of insurance. Now, was it enough? Obviously not. However, something that I would like to point out is if we had $10 million of insurance. So if we're looking at this slide, Greg, if you could go back to the same slide we were on a second ago, slide 5. Look at the equation here. It's FEMA projects plus mitigation minus insurance. Mm-hmm. So it doesn't matter if that $2 million was $10 million or $20 million. Not only would it not been enough, it would only have reduced the amount of money FEMA gave us.
That's a good point, yeah.
Okay, so unless we had a $69 million policy, which the building wasn't worth that, so we couldn't have wrote a policy that large.
Right.
We would have only reduced FEMA's cost share in this project. It wouldn't have saved us time. It wouldn't have put us in a better financial situation.
So do you have that $2 million sitting around? Where's that money going right now?
We have about $1.5 million of it left.
Okay.
So, yes, we had that money, and we've used some of that to get to this point. So the village was provided to us, both from FEMA and from grant funds. However, there were other expenses in putting furniture in the building and other operating costs that has taken us to get to this point. And so we've got about $1.5 million left, and when we get to where all of our funding sources are, and I guess we can go ahead and slide to that point right now, and that is slide 17. If you look at all of our funding sources here, back to the 37.7 FEMA funding, insurance, we still have around $1.5 million left. There's still $800,000 in bond funds from 2016. So in 2016, we put a bond together that was going to put renovations in Henderson Middle School and in Sour Lake. Unfortunately, some of those dollars were spent at Henderson Middle School before the flood, but some of them were not. There was still $800,000 to projects that hadn't been completed yet. And the board and the administration had both decided from the start of this that those dollars were committed to Henderson. And even though we had plenty of projects that could use attention, that we felt like we had promised the community that these money were going to go towards Henderson and we were going to save them until we were actually rebuilding the permanent structure. And so that $800,000 is still there. We have around $4 million in other grant funds, miscellaneous here and there, for a total of $44 million of recovery. So if we went back to our cost sheet, Greg, that's slide 18, we just hit Henderson Middle Schools at $45 million. If we look at our total cost, which the middle school is $45 million, the field house, concession stands, and restrooms consolidated into one structure are $7.7 million. Improvements to the stadium are $2.7. Replacing the tennis courts because the new field house will actually sit on top of where the tennis courts are, and because they're in terrible shape, they're old. We actually use those for a parking lot when we were building the original high school. So they weren't in good shape then, and they're still not in good shape now. They need to be replaced. An auditorium for 6.1, miscellaneous demo. So the miscellaneous demo is demoing projects that aren't being rebuilt. So demos in all the rebuild numbers except for the buildings that aren't being rebuilt. So we wanted to include that cost. And then we felt like we needed about a 10% contingency to make sure, again, there's fear of inflation and there's fear that these FEMA projects will run higher than a normal construction cost. So we want to be able to guarantee the community that we're going to be able to build what we're saying we're going to be able to build. So we felt like a 10% contingency number was a comfortable number, and that puts us at a total project cost of $69 million. So 69 minus the 44 is why we're asking for $25 million in bond funds.
Gotcha. And there's two different bonds, correct? How is that? What are the two different bonds? Can you talk about the
Absolutely.
difference?
So, Greg, slide 20, I believe. So, yes, there is two propositions, Proposition A and Proposition B. I will tell you up front, these were designed as one package, okay? We actually have one of the buildings we're planning on building is in both props. And the reason that there are two propositions is the legislature last session had decided to add language that states if you're making an addition or creating a stadium that sits more than 1,000 people, in our current football stadium / soccer stadium / marching fields sits around 2,500. But if the stadium sits more than 1,000 people, that you have to put any improvements to that in a separate proposition. So whereas the field house is classroom space, so those kids report to that daily. That's where they go to athletics. That's where all male and female sports work out. That's where the teachers or coaches' offices are located. That really isn't a function of the football field. That's a function of the day-to-day operations of the school. So that's in Proposition A. But the restrooms and concession stands that are also part of the same building, but they are a function of a stadium because they are serving as restrooms for the stadium and concession stands for the stadium. They're actually in Prop B. Okay. So Prop B includes stadium restrooms, stadium concession stands, the track, football field, soccer, marching field surface, improvements to that, stadium lighting, and then a small amount of contingency. The lion's share of the contingency that we're talking about would be in Prop A. And then Prop A covers everything else. So it's got funds in there for Henderson Middle School, an auditorium, the field house, tennis courts, the miscellaneous demo, and the majority of that contingency.
Okay, so just help me understand. So I can vote for both of these, or I'm picking one or the other?
You're not picking both or the other. You have to vote for. You have to vote on both of these.
I have to vote on. So I can vote yes on one, no on one, or yes or
you could vote yes or no
yes
on both propositions.
Gotcha. Okay. Because I think that the perception in the community, some of the feedback I've heard is that one's more athletic and one's more for Henderson Middle School and some of the other stuff.
Well, I mean, obviously one's stadium, and so it's easy to correlate that that's just for athletics. I would like to point out two things about the stadium. One, the football stadium is, and we call it the football stadium, but Hawk Stadium is the only place in our community where 2,000 to 3,000 people will gather at one time in our entire school district. Two, more students perform on that field than anywhere else in our district.
And it's not just the football team.
It is the football team. It is the drill team. It is the cheerleaders. It is the band.
Yeah.
It's the middle school football team. It's the soccer team. It is the little kids who run out on the field before the game. I mean, it is really a place where the community comes together, and it is the window to the way other people see your community.
Correct.
So when you go, if you think about the other schools that you visited, most of the time when you visited them, you saw their fields. You don't go into their chemistry lab.
Right.
You don't go into their library, and most times you don't even enter their school. you enter, you see their stadium, you see their football field,
The
and
concession stand, yeah.
those are the areas, and that's a lot of the times how you form opinions about that school and whether or not. I'm not saying that is the reason that you move there. I feel like Hardin-Jefferson offers an outstanding education. That is by far and large our primary mission and goal, and the reason that we feel that so many people want to live in our area. But as far as a visual, this is the visual that they get when they come to visit us.
Gotcha. And I've been on your track, Brad, and I just have to say there's like some grass coming up in that, and I've heard you can't even have UIL practice there. Is that true?
Well, practice we can.
Or meets.
We can't have meets, and so we have several issues with our track. One, it was built poorly, and so it's got 7 lanes on it, whereas it only has room for 6. And so when you try to put hurdles on the track, the hurdles are wider than the lanes, and so they overlap. And so if you can imagine that picture of someone knocking down a hurdle as they're running down the track, now imagine that hurdle is partially in the lane next to you.
Right.
So that really creates problems when you're talking about holding a track meet there.
Right.
And right now, quite frankly, it's unsafe to hold a track meet. We've got some delamination pieces. The track honestly wasn't in good shape prior to the storm, and putting several feet of water on it didn't help it.
Gotcha.
So what we're proposing is replacing it and making sure that what we replace it with will hold up well. We know it will flood again, and we want to make sure that it's designed to withstand a couple feet of water for several days, and we will make sure that happens.
So I'm just going to throw this out there, but like, what if neither of them pass? Like, what happens? Like, what if?
So
are we just not going to be able to rebuild Henderson, or?
Yeah. So we put a committee together, a committee of citizens. It was about 58 citizens and staff members to give us an idea of what we wanted to, how they want it to proceed.
So you got the public's opinion. Wasn't it just Brad making decision or HJ?
This was not an administrative decision,
okay,
or just a bond decision. And so we knew that bonds can be a hot topic.
Right.
And so nobody wants to go into a bond without having community buy-in and getting that information ahead of time. And so we built a committee and designed the committee intentionally to have people that have historically put downward pressure on raising taxes. Okay, so we have made the mistakes before. I think in other instances, we have made the mistakes of putting too many people on the committee that were pro-school. They're the people we know. They're the people that like us and they support us.
So you're looking for those people that are going to be vocal.
We wanted a mix, and we wanted people that had a lot of land. We wanted farmers that they have a big stake in this. You know,
right.
it costs them money to pass a bond, and we wanted to make sure that they had a voice. We wanted people that historically are not just supportive of the district, of its decisions, to help guide us in this process. So hopefully what we've developed is a package that the community likes. And so the plan is that they pass, and that they pass together, because that's how they were built.
Okay. So if they don't pass, what happens? Are we just
nothing in the short
stay
term,
in the village?
In the short term, nothing happens.
Okay.
And we have to figure out what's next. The plan is it passes, and if it doesn't pass, we have to develop a new plan.
Will we lose that FEMA money because we won't be?
We still could have the ability to tap into that FEMA money.
Okay.
But as stated earlier, we don't have it. So,
right.
So I guess what happens is nothing happens until we develop a plan that the community will support.
Gotcha. I'm looking at the numbers. Let's see how it's going to affect households. I mean,
okay,
I live in Sour Lake. I want to know how much are my taxes going to go up.
Greg, if you'll move to slide 19. And for those of you that are listening to this and don't know who Greg is, we didn't introduce him. Greg is someone who has offered to let us share his studio and help us out in the production of this. And so thank you for your help. All right. So on slide 19, it shows what the cost to the taxpayer is.
Okay.
And so all of these costs are running under the assumption that we're talking about the whole bond, so the whole $25 million. They're not broke out by proposition.
Okay.
And so if this bond passed, looking at current tax values, it should cost 11.5 cents or add 11.5 cents to the tax rate.
Okay.
All right. And so if you had a $100,000 home with a homestead exemption on it, it would cost you annually $69.19 a year, or around 19 cents a day.
Wow. So you're looking at $70 a year?
$70 a year on a $100,000 valuation.
To do all that. That's a pretty good number.
Right.
For
so,
the 69
million. Something that we're trying to let everyone know or leaving message is that we're talking about building $69 million in projects at a $25 million community cost.
That's amazing.
It is not something that we would have been able to do. I mean, if we were talking about rebuilding this campus, I mean, this campus was near the end of its life.
It was.
Anyway.
I remember.
But if we were looking at making these improvements just because it was time, this 11-cent tax rate, I don't have the numbers on me, and so I can't say for sure. But we're talking at least almost 3 times the cost. So instead of an 11-cent tax rate, we would be in the 30-something range of taxes added if we were paying for the entire $69 million.
Wow. And, I got this. I printed this off the Hardin-Jefferson ISD website, so you can go there and see this flyer. And one thing, I was trying to crunch the numbers. Math is not my forte. But the $69.19 for a $100,000 home, that, like you said, is including the homestead exemption.
Yeah,
right?
so you can't multiply 11 cents times a $100,000
Right,
home because the math doesn't work, right?
Right.
And so actually, Hardin-Jefferson residents get 2 homestead exemptions. So there is a state mandated $25,000 homestead exemption. However, there is also an additional homestead exemption granted by our Board of Trustees for an extra 15%. And, we've actually had instances where we were in financial cuts or financial shortfalls, tight years, and we're looking at trying to produce extra revenue. And we looked at taking out this optional homestead exemption, and they were adamant that they weren't going to take this away from the citizens, and they felt like this was a good thing. So I think kudos to them for keeping this there. And so the first thing you have to do is take your appraised value and reduce it by the 15%.
Okay.
So if you had a $100,000 home, you would reduce that by 15% or get $85,000. You would then take the $25,000 off of that. You take that and you multiply that times 0.1153, divide that by 100 because it's 11 cents per $100 of evaluation, and that's where you would get that $69 number. And so if anybody's looking how to extrapolate this to their house, I mean, we've got the numbers on this slide and on our website for $100,000, $200,000, $250,000. But if you're looking at an exact cost for you, that's how you would do the math.
Gotcha. Did you follow that math, Greg?
Sure.
Well, does that factor in if I'm over 65? What happens to the seniors with their exemption? Are they going to lose it? They're worried about that.
All right, so over 65, that's on slide 21. Once you hit 65 on homesteaded property, and so we need to be clear that this is on homesteaded property only. This doesn't include rental property, doesn't include commercial property or farmland. It's only over 65 homesteaded land.
Okay.
Once you turn 65, you can apply for the over 65 homestead exemption, or the over 65 exemption, which creates a tax ceiling. So the addition of this bond, or vote if this bond passes, it will not affect that tax ceiling. So let's run through an example.
Okay.
Last year you turned 65 and you paid $1,000 in tax.
Okay.
That $1,000 is your tax ceiling. And just because the tax rate goes up, or even if you the appraisal value, so, sometimes we get credit for the appraisal values going up. That is not something we control. The appraisal district does that. I do realize that it still makes your taxes go up anyway.
Right.
I get that. But even though their appraised value may increase and the tax rate may increase, that $1,000 ceiling doesn't change.
Good.
And so this bond will not affect the tax rate or the tax ceiling for over 65. Now, one thing I always like to clarify, because I've been in meetings before where they're like, well, I know a guy and his taxes went up. If you add property, if you add a shop, if you add a 1,500 square foot addition to your house, if you put a pool in your backyard, you are adding to your property, they will assess the value of that new property and will create a new ceiling that year.
Okay.
And so if you add an addition that's worth $20,000, they will add that $20,000 worth of property and tax it at the current rates and create a new ceiling.
That's not the school's fault if you go in. Okay.
Well, I just want to make sure, I want to be clear of what we're talking about.
Gotcha.
That's not due to the bond.
Okay.
Now, I don't have a slide for this, but I do have an interesting bit of information. I was going over tax rates, and so I've put together a chart that we'll eventually get on this slideshow and on our website of historical tax rates over the past 20-odd years. And if you go back to 2016 and 2017, our combined tax rate was $1.37.
Okay.
So our M&O, which is maintenance and operations. So maintenance and operations pays the bills.
Right.
It pays the teachers, it pays the light bills, supplies. And INS is what we've been talking about today, and that's your debt payment. That's your mortgage payment.
Okay.
So we had $1.04 in M&O, and we were charging 33 cents in INS for a $1.37 tax rate. Okay, so that was in 2016, 2017. Well, in 2017, 2018, we were at, and for 18, 19 actually, we were at $1.04 for M&O again, but the valuation of the properties escalated slightly, and we were able to drop the INS tax rate to $1.30. Okay. And then in 2019, 2020, the legislature passed House Bill 3, which was a monumental school finance bond or school finance law that made many changes. One of those changes was tax rate compression. So now the district can't take credit for this. This is not something we affected. So we're not trying to take a credit for it. However, the legislature created tax rate compression. And so that tax rate went from $1.04 to 97 cents. So it actually decreased 7 cents.
Wow. Okay.
And we were able to keep our INS rate the same at 30 cents. Okay, so we're now down to $1.27. Next year, we will see further compression at it's 1.38 pennies, I believe. So next year, our M&O tax rate will compress down to 95 cents, 0.9564, or so 95.5 cents basically. And if you add the 11.5 or the 11.5 cents that we're talking about adding to the bond, now it wouldn't increase that fast because we wouldn't sell all your bonds right up front. But let's just say we did for argument's sake.
Okay.
If you take that new compressed rate and add that 11.5 cents, that gets you to 137.5. That is the tax rate that we were at in 16, 17.
So everyone's been so worried this is just going to shoot up, but I mean, it's not.
Don't get me wrong, it's an increase. Okay.
It's not like.
It's higher than it would be. I don't want to misstate this. It is higher than it would be if they didn't pass it. It is an increase. And so we don't want to make a misstatement here. But it was the same rate that you were paying roughly 5 years ago. And like I said, last year it went down 7 cents. This year it decreases a little bit more to 1.38, and we're asking to add 11.
Gotcha. Okay, that makes sense. I'm glad you broke it down like that. I don't know. This is kind of I'm learning from this. So
good. Hopefully everybody is.
Yes. I mean, I want to be a better informed person. I want to know the bottom line. How much are my taxes going to go up, and how's it going to affect me? How's it going to affect the community? So when do you think these projects would begin? Like if the bond's passed, when are we going to start Like,
Okay.
what's the next step? Are we going to go out for bids? When do we start the building? Like,
Okay, so you have to have construction documents
Okay.
Before you can go out for bids.
Okay.
And the construction documents for a building this size, just talking about the middle school, there's other projects, but the most important one is the middle school,
Right.
Can take 9 to 12 months.
Okay.
And so if everything went well and this passes, we should be looking to go out for bid. And again, I want to reiterate, because this is important and I think a sticking point with some people, this will be a hard bid. Right? This is a lowest qualified bidder wins.
Gotcha.
And so hopefully we're talking about going out to bid sometime around this year or this time next year. And if that goes well, we should be in the buildings fall of 2003.
So, Brad, I want to ask you a question. What made you guys decide to rebuild Henderson where it is? I mean, it's just going to flood again, right?
So, location was a pretty substantial decision.
I've heard some rumors, yeah.
So the board came to me and wanted me to do an exhaustive property search for other potential locations for a new middle school. So I went to every major landowner in town or in our area. And so we looked at properties in Sour Lake. We looked at properties in Nome. We looked at properties in China. We then plotted those and build matrix showing what our population densities were in some of our subgroups of our populations. And so we looked at the population of students in China proper, and then the population of students over by Turner Road, and then in Sour Lake, and then in Bevel Oaks, and then in Countrywood, Pinewood, and all of those places. And did try to do an extrapolation to see which location would be the most efficient. So that was the first thing that we looked at on the property, was which of these properties are centrally located and going to be the most convenient for our community. We also looked at staff sharing. So we share lots of staff. I don't know if a lot of people know this, but we have a lot of middle school teachers that coach at the high school. We have high school teachers that coach at the middle school. We've got a theater art teacher that teaches on both campuses. Our band directors teach on both campuses.
Those campuses need to be close together.
Well, they don't have to be. There's a cost for them not to be. So if they're together, then you don't lose a period of transition. So you don't lose a period in them driving over there. If they're right across the street, they're able to walk from building to building, and it's more efficient in operational costs. Not overcomable, but something that we wanted to quantify.
Okay.
Facility sharing. So, I mean, if you build a new middle school, it's going to need practice fields. It's going to need a track, in addition to what is already at the high school. And so it's additional fields to build, and it's additional fields and places to maintain. We looked at growth. And now I know growth is a big one. I've heard...
there's a big neighborhood going in Nome. There's Sour Lake is expanding.
Yes. So we actually took a pretty good look at growth. Okay. We hired a demographer, which is someone who goes in and studies the community, looks at house sale rates, it looks at new house rates, it looks at growth in our schools, it looks at birth rates, trying to project kindergartners. It was a pretty detailed report on what they thought our growth might be, and they felt like we would grow, maybe 400 students in 10 years. Which divided over 4 campuses isn't a whole lot per classroom.
So that's 400 across all campuses,
that would be
not
400,
just Henderson.
Yeah,
okay.
Not just Henderson.
Okay.
That was 400 across the district.
Okay.
But even that is a guess, because he's looking at historical information, and right now we have what we would consider the potential for growth. We have some neighborhoods going in at a lower price point than what we've seen before. A lot of our new housing were in the $300,000 and $400,000 range, and so the potential for a new neighborhood, specifically the one in Nome, at a lower price point, has the potential to create more avenues for starter homes and families looking for starter homes to move into the district. So, is there a potential for growth? Absolutely. But what we found is we couldn't prove the growth. We don't have a trajectory of what that growth is going to look like, an actual accurate trajectory of what that growth looks like over the next 4 or 5 or 10 years. If you actually look at our historical data, in the past decade, there's only two real bumps in student enrollment. One is when we took open enrollment, which was 7-8 years ago, and the other one is when we took on Bevel Oaks.
Right.
And so this year is the first year that we've seen significant growth, around 140 kids, outside of something we could point our finger to and say, oh, well, it was that, and it's going to plateau. Now, some of this growth that we saw this year could still be turnover of homes in Bevel Oaks and Pinewood. So when it flooded, there were several homes, there were several of an older generation that lived there whose kids had already graduated and moved on and wanted to stay in the area because they liked it. And now because of the flood, that has convinced them to move out of that area. But that has created, again, that starter home price for families in a desirable neighborhood. And so a lot of families are moving into those houses. So if the growth is coming predominantly from that, then we could potentially see a plateau. Whereas if it's coming from new home growth, obviously that's going to continue to expand. So what we decided is we definitely need to be prepared for growth. We need to think about the locations that we pick and make sure that the location can handle the growth. Right. We need to make sure the buildings that we build are expandable so we can handle the growth. But what we didn't want to do is pour a lot of dollars into existing facilities or overbuild this current facility, this middle school that we're talking about, for growth that may happen. So could we potentially be coming back in 5 or 8 or 10 years and saying, okay, we're growing and we need to do something about it? That is absolutely possible. But at this point, we didn't have enough factual data that we felt like we could prudently and fiscally conservatively ask for the money to build those facilities. And so we looked at, so yes, we looked at growth, and yes, we looked at growth when we sized the building. And the building's going to be designed for around 700 kids, which is 100 to 120 more than what we currently have. So there is built-in growth to this building, but we didn't want to build it for 200 or 300 more or add a lot of expensive square foot to other buildings without knowing that this is coming. And once we know, we'll do something about it. But we want to make sure that we're being conservative in our approach. And then we looked at cost. Back to the location, we looked at cost. And so when we added all of these factors together, and when we added the factor, your original question was, well, couldn't it flood again? Well, one, we're building it higher than we built the high school that didn't flood. So the high school is a foot above BFE, base flood elevation, and we're talking about building this one at a minimum of 2 feet above BFE. When we look at the fact that China Elementary flooded in Imelda and didn't in Harvey, and China Elementary is not in the floodplain, and looked at the differences of those two storms and how it reflooded some areas and didn't flood others, and flooded new areas that weren't flooded before, what we've determined is there's pretty much any property in our area could flood it at a certain time. And so we need to make the best choice with all of the parameters that we have, and the board decided that they felt like the current location was the best choice. And so that's where we're planning to put it.
Well, let me ask you, said you would elaborate earlier. If you're raising Henderson up, is that going to affect the high school if we have another flood again? Is that going to?
The answer is no. And I want to go to slide 2. And this slide's not meant for this, but I think it paints a big picture. If you look on the right-hand side of this slide, you can see the buildings when they were flooded. And if you can, imagine the size of this lake. Okay, right. So this lake spanned just in width, not length. I mean, because length was tremendous. But in width, it went from the railroad tracks, or real near the railroad tracks in Sour Lake by the overpass, almost to the railroad tracks on Highway 90. Okay, so this is a huge lake. So let's talk about water volume. And so if you've got a cup of water and you're adding an inch to it, you need a little bit of water. But if you're adding an inch to a bathtub, you need a little bit more water, and an inch to a swimming pool, a little bit more water, and an inch to a lake, you need a ton of water. So the extra volume that you're adding to the building next to the middle school is minuscule in comparison to the size of the lake that the water is in at that point.
Gotcha.
So the extra foot or two that's higher on the left side doesn't automatically push that water.
It's not gonna make a difference.
It's not enough displacement on the size of a lake this big. It would take another tremendously big storm that would, and if the high school was going to flood, it's going to flood regardless of whether that building was beside it or not.
Gotcha.
Now, something I do want to address is really what you need to worry about, because there is a concern with bringing water in or land, field, dirt into a floodplain. And so there are rules and requirements that we will adhere to. And every or every truckload of dirt you bring in, you have to bring out of that floodplain. Okay, so you can't increase the size of the floodplain by the dirt you bring in.
Oh, I didn't know
that. We did that at the high school, and we've actually built a detention pond that most people don't know this there, over behind the practice fields, just to the north of the entire property. Mm-hmm. So we have a detention pond that offset the dirt we brought in for the high school. And so we will increase the size of that detention pond to offset the dirt that we have to bring in for the middle school. And what that does, it doesn't really affect this flood. It affects the low-lying neighbors to make sure that we retain on our property the same amount of water that we would have retained during a natural rain event had we not made the improvements to this property. And so it's designed by civil engineers to make sure, and approved by the floodplain administrator from the county. So it's checked by independent third parties. To make sure that we have a plan to hold all of our water, to make sure that we're not flooding our neighbors by adding more dirt to the property. So absolutely something we will do. So we're going to be a good neighbor here and not affect people negatively.
I didn't know that. I'm learned something. I'm glad you said that. Well, one thing that I've heard is, why don't you just take the current high school, make that Henderson middle school, and then build a new high school?
So I heard that too. Wasn't my initial thought, but we heard that, and so we researched it. Okay, maybe people have an idea here. Let's look at this.
Okay.
A couple things. We're talking about building a middle school that's 136,000 square feet. The current high school is 154,000 square feet. So one, we'd be talking about having to build a bigger facility. Two, there are spaces in the current high school that just don't work for the middle school.
For example?
Computer science labs are built a little bit differently for a middle school than they are a high school. The theater black box that you need for a high school is a little bit different. We don't have home ec or a cooking lab. We don't have HST. We don't sew. There are lots of classes that we don't do at the middle school. At the middle school that we do at the high school. And so not to say those places couldn't be repurposed, but we would be making the middle school or moving the middle school kids into a building that's slightly too big, that would need renovation dollars to fix spaces to put them in because the classes don't fit their current needs. And because the high school was built to run in conjunction with a field house, it doesn't have adequately sized locker rooms to support middle school athletic programs. And so the middle school building will support athletics for all of the middle school kids. They don't use the field house. The field house is a high school structure.
Right.
So we would actually have to add on to a building that is too big to make space because it has to be in the right spot, right? You can't have it on the educational side of the building. It has to be on the athletic side of the building. So we would actually be adding space to a building that's too big to make it work for a middle school, and then build a more expensive high school somewhere else.
Gotcha. That makes sense.
And so when we looked at the cost, our high school fits our needs. Everybody's proud of it. It's a beautiful campus.
It's a beautiful building. Yeah.
It's been well taken care of, and just felt like it was, again, fiscally responsible to rebuild the middle school and not go after a more expensive high school.
Okay, I have a question that I think a lot of folks may be looking at this flyer, and let's talk about the auditorium. Okay, so you've got $6 million here. What's the size of the auditorium? I heard it's going to be a little bit smaller. So can you explain that?
Absolutely.
What is the current Henderson auditorium? What did that seat?
Okay, so when we're talking about auditoriums and size, there's two different metrics to a size of an auditorium. One is how many seats did it have in it, and two is what is the square footage of that auditorium. First, the square footage of the auditorium will not be smaller. However, the seats in the auditorium will be less.
Can you explain why you're making it smaller?
Absolutely.
The seats.
Well, one, the reason what let's first explain why the square footage doesn't change.
Okay.
One, the stage was a little too small in our old auditorium, and we need to build it a little bit bigger to accommodate the needs for one-act play and band concerts and other things. Secondly, fire code laws have changed since 1960 when this building was built. And so you're required to have more aisles. You're required to have more space between aisles and more fire exits. And so the room gets bigger with less seats in it. And so from a cost standpoint, we're replacing a very similar square footage, but from a seating capacity, it's less. We originally, like most people, were like, we need to build what we had. And so we priced an auditorium with 1,000. You know what? Well, let's build it a little bit bigger.
Mm-hmm.
Let's be able to have a little bit more capacity in that building.
Right.
And we got a price tag of $10 to $12 million.
Oh, wow.
And there was a little bit of sticker shock with that.
Right.
And so we went and looked at some of the other schools that do have auditoriums. You look at bigger schools. You go look at Beaumont. Beaumont just put an auditorium at Westbrook. It's 1,234 kids. Well, Westbrook has around 2,500. If you go look at Barbers Hills High School, there sits 800, and they have around 1,500 kids. Lamar University sits 500 kids. And so what we were finding is that most schools today aren't building auditoriums to seat their entire student body. They're building auditoriums to fit their needs. And so we went back and looked at what is our needs. Well, one, we want to have a great place for our students to perform. Mm-hmm. We want something that is built acoustically well, which is not something we had with our old auditorium. It was basically a canyon with a wavy wall in it. And so acoustically it was poor. And so we want to build something that's a good space so when our kids, after working really hard on perfecting their performances, are able to showcase themselves and do well, not just in, those are the band, that's one-act play, that's our dancers. We want to be able to utilize this for school. We've talked to the high school principal, and he's actually wanting to put a class in there daily to give some of our college-bound kids the experience of learning in a lecture hall.
Oh, that's a good idea.
So before you go to college, if you're used to sitting in a class with 25 kids, and then you go to a major university and sit in a classroom with 300 or 400 kids, that can be quite a shock.
It could be.
So let's give them an intermediate step and be able to build it for put 100 or maybe 100 kids in a class, or 75 or more than 25 in a class, and learn how to learn in that lecture hall experience, so they're more prepared when they get to college. We talked to the principals about what's a good size, and both middle school and high school, because it'll be a shared facility. It'll be attached to the high school, but be shared by the middle school and the high school. They want it to be able to put around half of the high school's classes. They want to be able to put like 2 classes in there at once. And so we felt like the sweet spot of this, looking at price and functionality, was to build a auditorium that sat around 400 people.
400. What's the enrollment at Henderson currently?
580.
Wow. So 400. That's a
yeah.
big duration.
Our classes, a big class may get broached towards 200. I don't know that we've ever been beyond that. Average is around the 180 mark, and so for some time, 400 would sit 2 classes, both 2 classes of middle school students, or 2 grades of middle school students or high school students. Now we'll have to do things a little bit differently. We won't have a middle school band concert at the same night as a high school band concert and the same night as a choir concert. We'll be able to split those up. But that's not really an issue, and I actually think parents will probably appreciate that a little bit more. Just get to go see their kids in an intimate setting.
Versus like a big group, and you got to wait around for the high school if your child's in junior high. Yeah.
Correct. We think it'll be a great experience, and once people get used to it, they will really like the space, and it'll be a tremendous space for the district.
Gotcha. Well, Brad, I want to thank you so much for taking the time to talk with me today. And let me ask you, do you have any key takeaways that you want listeners to know?
Yeah, two things. One, we're having the opportunity to build $69 million in projects at a community cost of $25 million. And the other thing is that you need to get out and vote.
Okay, so let's talk about it.
That is the end of the original podcast. We cut off the end where we talked about polling locations and dates for May. Early voting will now be October 13th through the 30th, and Election Day is November 3rd. You will vote on the bond at the same location and on the same ballot that you vote for president. Please see hjisd.net/bond for more information and for a link to our Bond 2020 podcast update. Thank you for listening, and we hope you found this informative.